Welcome to The Longer Game, the only show that's dedicated to the future of retail. We bring on real-life people in the retail industry. We talk about their experiences, we share their stories, we apply it to what's currently going on in the market, and we look towards the future of retail. You could say it's Retail Reimagined. My name is Michael Marr. I run a customized, done-for-you service agency called Cartology that helps brands win on Amazon. Now, while my expertise stems in the Amazon field, we bring on a wide array of guests because retail is expansive. You've got e-commerce. Yes, you've got marketplaces like Amazon. You've also got brick and mortar that is evolving. You've got logistics. You've got technology, finance. There are so many aspects to retail, and it's complicated. So we're here to bring you the entire story. Do you think that you have an interesting story and you'd like to tell it on the podcast? Then go to thelongergame.com and fill out a form to be a guest on the show today. You can catch The Longer Game on any social channels: LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and our website, thelongergame.com. We've got all awesome guests on this show, so that I will promise. Are you ready to hear more about the future of retail? Let's get down to business. Welcome, everybody, to The Longer Game. We're in season 2. We're getting more sophisticated in our conversations, and we're having a deeper understanding of where retail is going. The first season, we had a lot of different types of guests, but I think we're starting to dig in deeper. And in the midst of the pandemic a couple years ago, which is kind of crazy to even think, we saw an acceleration of things in e-commerce, but we're starting to see things head back into brick and mortar stores as well. So a lot of interesting stuff going on. I'm excited to have Kenny Jen on the show, and he provides CFO services for consumer and retail brands. Kenny, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about Pilot, the company that you provide these services through.
Hey there, Michael. Really happy to be here. And yeah, happy to give a brief intro on myself. So as you had mentioned, I provide CFO services for consumer and retail clients through Pilot. I work with a number of different brands on that platform, including ones from apparel, food and beverage, pet products, and so on and so forth. So really work with a pretty wide range of brands that really touch direct to consumer, but also the retail channels as well. A little bit background on myself. I started off my career on Wall Street, worked there for a couple of years, really got my foray into the consumer and retail space through my next role at a venture capital fund that focused on the consumer space. And that's really where I got to work with a number of brands and their management teams on figuring out their strategic planning, their margins, how to think about the entrance into retail, and really started understanding some of the more nuanced aspects of it, including the supply chain and the arrangements that you had to make with the retailers themselves on how to make those launches happen. After that, I decided to work at a cannabis brand in Los Angeles, where I got my hands a little bit dirtier, helping a lot with their product development, their supply chain, working with the sales teams, and really had a much more nuanced understanding around the relationship between brands and retailers, because I was finally on the brand side of things.
Sure.
And sometime a couple of years after that, Pilot came up to me. Thought I saw a really good opportunity to really go back into being at a place where I could work with a lot of different brands at the same time and really get that landscape perspective. So happy to come back to Pilot and to really be offering these services to a number of different brands.
Man, we've talked before, but now I'm like, man, I have so many things that I want to talk about based on what you said. But first question I want to ask you is, how often is it that breakdancers come from Wall Street?
There was
is that common?
The only notable person what's really interesting is there is one notable person who actually was breaking, and he worked at Goldman Sachs, I think sometime in the 80s.
Oh,
his
okay.
last name is Graham.
And I say that because, Kenny, you are a breakdancer yourself, correct?
Yeah, I am. I've been dancing for about 16 years. It helps me, keeps me sane, and it's a nice contrast between the financial modeling and finance side of myself versus the creative dancing side. I even combine both of those worlds a bit. I actually model out my dance moves, so I'll put I'll have a bunch of different names for
That's awesome.
the combos that I have, and I put them together on the Excel sheet, and I'll try them out, basically kind of like testing the model through, and then just iterate from there.
Yeah, so there's one guy in the 80s, and then you, right? You're the second person that
that's
might
the
be the
second
most
person
notable.
I know about. Yeah. Although I will say for him, he actually ended up funding a lot of sponsored events that helped accelerate the culture into really
Okay.
commercializing it.
I
Yeah,
think
so which is why I wanted to mention him.
well, what I think is interesting is we look at someone, and it's really easy to typecast people based on. I mean, you can typecast people based on anything, race, gender, whatever the case might be. But even someone's job, you think, oh, a CFO or someone that's in finance, like that's a boring job. Maybe it's a boring job for you, but that person could be super adept at it and it is actually really interesting for them. But that also doesn't mean that they don't have interest outside of their job. Like I love helping brands grow on Amazon, but I have things that I love doing outside of that, like hanging out with my family and making music and trying great food and drinks and stuff like that and traveling. So it
Yeah.
shouldn't be a surprise, but it is always interesting when you think of something that's more like
Yeah.
straightforward and kind of like I don't want to say strict, but something that's very like professional, like finance. And you think about
Yeah.
someone that's also breaking. I'm going to use your terminology. You said breaking, so
Yeah.
I'm going to use that as well.
Perfect. And one thing I would say I really appreciated from both of those experiences is really understanding that mix of art and science. And they really do permeate between the two. For breaking, for example, you have a set of moves that you have as your foundation, but then from there you really have to create like a level of structure and discipline, and then but also have a creative process to nurture that as well. And then on the finance side, the reality is there's quite a bit of creativity that goes into that part of the discipline where you're essentially, yes, you have a set number of, let's say, formulas or aspects to understand, finance, but then there's so many components that, it's about scenario building. At the end of the day, it's about creating a scenario through a spreadsheet. And kind of the way I applied dancing was really using the same principles to be able to figure out what does, you know, building a scenario, what does my move probably look like if I put it together in these cells to see what the order is. I go test it out and then see if it really matches my thesis or not. And that's
Okay.
exactly what financial modeling is. You're building out what a business looks like, and you have to use a level of creativity to really see like what does it really mean to execute it this way, and then you have to test it out and then modify it from there.
So when you talked about getting your hands a little bit more dirty dealing with that cannabis business in California, I mean it's a newer industry that, especially with the issues that you can deal with from federal to state regulations, must have just been. I mean, I feel like a total change from maybe publicly traded companies who are dealing with tons of uh, regulation. And I mean, I think cannabis is probably dealing with regulation, but in a different way because it's state. There's some state changes or state regulations that might be different than federal, and you'd know this better than I would. But I say that because I brought that up because you talked about getting your hands dirty and helping them create products, and part of my mind is like, oh well, like do you get to test products? Like, are you taking them and using them? But I think what's even more interesting really is when you're coming up with something like that is more of a regulated substance. What are you like when you're coming up with a product line for something? What are the factors that are going into that? And there's also like dosage components that would go into something like that. So I'm curious to know what your experience was in helping brands to create
Yeah,
products. I'm sure there was also a level of like what consumers are
yeah.
into, and I don't know how much data is even out there for that.
Yeah, one of the things that I always found so fascinating about the cannabis space was during my time when I was at Venture, when I was covering food and beverage, and as I was closely following the way cannabis was evolving, I actually saw a lot of parallels between both of the industries and how they evolved. When you look at the natural food space sometime in the early 2000s, late 90s, I would say it has a very similar development path as to where cannabis is today.
Okay.
At the time, it was mostly, no, there weren't that many professionals in natural food space. It was much more of a hippie culture, and people were slowly starting to professionalize, and you were starting to see that mainstream aspects really come in. And really now it's very much part of the Whole Food, in Whole Foods everywhere, every even Ralph's and these other retailers have natural and organic as a main staple. But years ago it wasn't the case, and it took a while of development in infrastructure, scaling, and professionalization of the industry before it got to that place. And cannabis is really where whole natural foods was in that very beginning, with a few nuances, of course, right? Like what you mentioned with state regulations and the nuances surrounding that industry, and it provides a level of pushback in regards to how fast the industry can scale. But at the end of the day, the cannabis landscape very much operates similarly to food and beverage, where you have manufacturers, you have retailers and distributors, and you have to manage that entire supply chain. And a lot of brands are really nowadays taking on that asset light model where they're contracting out with players who are already a manufacturer, who are already a distributor, and you're actually just managing the entire supply chain, which is exactly what a lot of players in the food and beverage space do.
Like a lot of food and
So,
beverage brands right now, they're not, especially as they're getting started, they're not going and creating, like the 50 years, 60 years ago, they're not going and building $1 million plants and going and manufacturing their own stuff. They're going to people that do contract manufacturing. They're going to people that have the setup, and that these companies who are contract manufacturing, that's another source of revenue for them. Like, oh, we have this system. Let's basically license as a maybe not the best word to use, but we're licensing out this system to people and making stuff, helping them, formulate their stuff and then put it into packaging for them. And it's a way that allows them to have additional revenue. But these food and beverage companies can now get started with hopefully less capital than having to, do a couple $1 million loan on a building before they even get stuff produced.
exactly. Yeah, and what you saw in earlier stages of the cannabis space, because there was no infrastructure whatsoever, a lot of players had to come in with a lot of capital and basically take on the entire supply chain. They would grow it, they would manufacture it, they would distribute it, and sometimes even use their own retail stores to put out with it. But as you see the industry start to mature, you're going to see it more so like what you see in natural foods, which is specialists. You have a manufacturer who focuses on manufacturing. They don't care about marketing. They'd rather have brands come onto them and to be able to scale up their production, so that way they focus on efficiencies rather than a lot of areas where they really don't specialize in. And I think that evolution is going to be really key to having a lot more entrepreneurs enter the cannabis space, because now people can come in with an idea, work with a manufacturer or a cultivator on the product, and they can focus on the development of that and not necessarily on the investment of infrastructure, on getting all these efficiencies, because that's what the manufacturer is for.
What was one of the, just in still talking about the cannabis space, but what was one of the products that you helped work on that maybe was like the most surprising to you that took off or that worked really well?
Yeah, I'll answer this in a roundabout way. I'd say,
Okay.
one of the most fascinating categories that is in cannabis that I learned a lot about has been the edible space.
Okay.
And that's also kind of where I got a lot of learnings in regards to the parallels between the natural food space and kind of where the edible space has evolved.
Sure.
And when it comes to cannabis, though, there's still so much innovation that can be done on infusing that I'm just so excited for it. And is also probably one of the biggest challenges that I noticed in regards to really making it fit with products. Because at the end of the day, cannabis is actually a fat soluble oil.
Great.
And when you, for example, put it into a carbonated beverage or anything that's a liquid, if you just infuse it directly, the oil actually separates from the liquid, so it actually ends up kind of being a gross surface level oil that when you drink it, you can taste it, and it's not evenly distributed. And
That's
right
why
now,
your
there's a lot
friend
of
would always make
technology.
butter. I remember a cousin who
Exactly.
would make butter and it'd be like, hey, he made brownies, so don't go and eat those brownies because it had. I always wondered like how people would get that into food before it was like there were more,
Yeah.
like actual food components. So that's good to know.
Yeah. And butter works because it's fat, because it's a fat. So that way you
Right.
can actually have those molecules work together. But as you start to see this industry move into what they believe is the next step of really commercialization, which is beverages, you're seeing a lot more technology around the idea of making it water soluble. Or they have sometimes technology where they basically break down the cannabis oils into basic molecules and try to basically make them so small so that way it forces the mix. But I think you're going to start to see more innovation around that. And as you see more of that, you'll start to see more scale. And then the price points come down to make it a lot more commercially accessible for everybody.
Brands get really excited when they get started because they've got a really good idea and they believe in that idea. And
Hmm.
I think that's where entrepreneurialism, let's just say that's the word, that's where it starts with. I have an idea of something that I think could work, and then it, like you said, you build a model of what you think will work, and then you go out and test that. I think a lot of times in any scenario, any business owner, they might make an estimation of what's going to happen, but a lot of times it can take a lot longer, both in time, but also require a lot more money to get to where you need to go. That doesn't mean that what you're doing, what your end goal is impossible, but it does mean that you sometimes can get really excited and maybe you want to jump the gun on getting to that place where whatever you define or determine success is. And I think most brands and businesses would be better off at the get-go saying, instead of just having an idea, but like, what do we really believe success is for us? Because if it's hitting a certain revenue mark, great, at least you're clear on that. But if you're just trying to grow revenue, but you don't really know to what point, I think you end up missing out on probably the feeling more of a feeling like you're successful and what you're doing is working. I preface all that to my next point, which is brands that are wanting to get into retail. There's a lot of things that they have to think about in order to get in there, and it's not just create a product, find the right manufacturer or co-packer or whatever, and get stuff going, and then get into stores, and then boom, it starts selling. A lot of people think about that with Amazon. Like, I got a product, I put it up on Amazon, it's just going to sell. There's way more to it than that. But what do you feel like are some of the things, or maybe even like the top thing that brands going into retail that they're not factoring in, that if they could walk away from hearing this episode, they'd be like, okay, now I know in my plan I need to factor this in? Because a lot of people will say, hey, I learned this the hard way, but what's a way that we could help someone not have to learn the hard way, but know right out front, here's something I need to make sure I consider in my plan to actually be success, not just get into retail, because that's part of it, but if people don't buy your product, you go belly up.
Exactly. And I'm going to take a little bit of my experience from my time in VC and the way that we were really looking at what brands were investable or not based on their retail footprint. One thing that I think a lot of brands mistake is they mistake distribution as success. Like, I hit a store, I'm going to be in 1,500 stores now with this partner. That's going to get me everywhere. I'm going to sell bananas, and I'm going to do great. And I think that is actually a very misleading concept, because from a acquire perspective, or even from an investor standpoint, we're not necessarily really even looking at, okay, hey, you're going to be in all these stores, or hey, you're in a Whole Foods. That's amazing. What they're really looking at is, are people buying your product? And that one key metric that is actually always used all the time is units per store per week. And they want to see how well you're moving. And to be, to have a product and to convince somebody that you want to be in all their stores is definitely a huge, definitely a successful benchmark. But I would say you're definitely putting the cart in front of the horse, because you want to be able to prove to at least yourself that if you're putting it on the shelf, that it's actually going to move. And I think one of the best ways to really do that testing is to actually just start local. Really look at
Yeah,
your, find the areas and the specialty retailers and the boutique shops that really resonate with your brand, who you believe can really merchandise your product well and really capture your customer, and go up to them. And they're individual stores, so you can actually have a direct relationship with the buyer who can tell you what is going on in the stores, what's moving, and start from there. And you can start with low volumes. Because I think one of the aspects too that it ends up becoming a big mistake for a lot of brands is they figure out a formulation, they get they get some packaging, and they feel super confident about their initial iteration. It's something you created, so you have that level of
sure.
emotional investment. The challenge, though, is
Everyone's baby
that
is the
level
most
of
beautiful baby in the world.
exactly, exactly.
I'm not
It's the
saying they're
best looking
not,
thing ever.
people. I'm just saying you got to bias as a parent.
Yeah, and the reality is a lot of products really take several iterations to get to the point of really hitting a lot of the marks that they didn't realize before. And I mean, one example that I always like to cite is how, if you have a product design that you really love, and then you buy, hundreds of thousands of pieces only to put on the shelf, and to later find out that everyone else has the same color scheme, just because it looks great in isolation doesn't necessarily mean that it's gonna really stand out on the shelf, because there's a lot more nuances around that landscape that you have to account for. And if you start with a smaller store where you have other competitors but you're not committing all this volume, you can at least test it out and really see for yourself, and to really be able to have that ability to pivot as necessary, so that way you can make the changes necessary to actually move your product. And once you have that traction, then you build off of that momentum. You want to be able to make sure that where you're distributing is also an area that you can really get good data out of, so that way you can continue that momentum. You want to have a few number of stores that move really well,
Yeah.
build that base, and then expand from there rather than going into a bunch of stores at once, only to find out a lot of them don't work. And now you have all this capital that's tied up in areas where they aren't moving. And next thing you know, the retailer might just put a fire sale on your product, and you're really eating the cost.
Well, there's no foundation there. I liken that to the American Idol model of becoming a superstar. You just immediately burst onto the scene. You've got no base to go from. You've got no years of building up people that like the product or that can be advocates for the product or that like you as an artist and see you grow and like, oh, their new music that came out, I like that. You get on the scene and maybe you do well for a year and then people forget about you because they're on to the next thing and you haven't really built something that's worth sticking around for. And I think I saw someone post about this on LinkedIn recently, going to some kind of innovation at a innovation center at a larger retailer. It was Lowe's specifically, but they talked about how it's easy as a founder or the starter of a brand to get really focused on, man, look at how cool my brand is, as opposed to thinking, does this actually solve a problem or does it actually meet the real need that a consumer has? And not just, hey, here's a need, we solve it, but like, is that the real need or is there something deeper that you can tap into with a consumer? Because I think there's a lot more psychology and emotion that go into purchasing. I think there's more data that's coming out, but there's a lot of nuances to anything. But why someone goes and purchases something, it's not always just, I need apples and so I get apples. It might be, hey, I'm looking for this specific type of food that meets my dietary restrictions and I'm in this certain phase of my life and I've got this much money. Like all those kinds of constraints determine why people would purchase something. And so if you're in the mindset of, man, I've just got this best product and everybody wants it, and you're not willing to get feedback and adjust and say, oh, okay, well, I have a good initial concept, but I have to refine it because people actually are reacting with this way. When you go all in on something that you're so focused on your own idea, I think it ends up hurting you.
Exactly. And to build on top of that, I think that's why you're really starting to see this huge emphasis around the curation of your community as one of the most single integral parts of building your brand, especially on the onset, because that community is going to be core to not only providing the necessary social support, but also providing the necessary feedback and to let you know exactly how they're shopping, why they're shopping, and what would change their mind to really be able to, become not only a purchaser of your product, but also an advocate. And I think those details really matter because say you really know your customer in terms of their wants and needs, but you also need to understand their behaviors. When are they making those buying decisions? Where are they doing that? Is there a certain time of day that they're usually thinking about this occasion? And to kind of bring it back into the cannabis ecosystem, just to provide a relevant example, there was a period of time in the industry where tons of money was running into the space because legalization was happening and everyone was trying to capture that modern consumer, the soccer moms and the suits who they inevitably thought that was going to be shopping and buying cannabis now that it was legal.
Yeah.
And it was probably half true. I'd say one of the biggest challenges that a lot of brands really saw was that you were limited to distributing within dispensaries, which are not distribution channels that these audiences really went to on a regular basis, right? So that it provided an extra level of challenge because you're not able to meet them exactly where they shop, so that occasion to purchase is not there, even though it could have been a product that they very much wanted.
And the
But
shopping experience
it's
at a
just
dispensary is very different than going into
it
a
is.
store, and like it's gated. It's, at least in my experience, just here in Ohio, it's very gated, and it's not like you're freely allowed to just roam around. Like it definitely is more of a curated experience, and you're also relying upon that person. Like, hey, I'm looking for this thing or this specific thing. Can you tell me more about it? Now you're relying upon their
Yeah.
product knowledge, and do they even know much about what it is that you want or much about the products?
Yeah, and when it comes to consumable products as well, when you look at the mainstream space, particularly beverages, but also food as well, distribution is a really key component that people are purchasing because it's readily available. They go to the grocery store, they see it on the shelf, and they
Right.
immediately buy it. And to kind of circle that back to kind of what I was mentioning earlier around distributing too large, that's why I emphasize the idea of wanting to be everywhere, but within a very particular region. You want the customer who lives around this area to see it, to see a product all the time, and to get that brand awareness. But that doesn't mean that you have to be in every store across the nation. It just means that you have to be maybe at a lot of stores within a particular area. But then to also loop it back into the cannabis market, if I'm not going to those areas where I'm actually being exposed to a brand, then I'm not building brand affinity. I'm not actually meeting where this brand is trying to target me. And that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges right now, on top of the fact that you don't have Instagram and Facebook as an avenue to really do this advertising.
Yeah, because
So
they
to your
regulate,
point,
right? That
it
they
runs the
say you
same
can't
rules.
advertise or do anything, right?
Yeah,
On Facebook or Instagram. Okay.
yeah. I would say purchasing behaviors still run the same rules, but you're just because of those regulatory aspects, it then provides a lot of roadblocks for you to be able to achieve the same level of tactics that you would in food and beverage, right? Like
Yeah.
another big one that I think is critical in customer acquisition for consumer products in general is sampling, right?
I was
One
gonna
of like
say, if you're in a local store
mhm,
and you can sample and talk to people about stuff, like especially with something you're ingesting and putting in your body, flavor, it might look great, it might have really awesome, sexy packaging, but if it tastes like shit, people are not gonna want to eat it. So if you can sample, and I think it can be subjective because someone might say, oh, I love this, but then you actually watch, like, this is something I value, but then you go and watch their behavior, and they're like, well, they said they valued brand over price, but they're really choosing price every time. So there's a little bit of subjectivity there, but if you can go in
yeah,
and sample and get feedback from people and just interact with your customer, like, I think that's huge, and that's something that's hard to
yeah,
do on a national level.
yeah. These touch points all really matter, and that's why I think you're also starting to see that shift of D2C back into retail, because now we're in a market where it's just you have easy accessibility to seeing a brand online, but you're just being inundated with everything else, and that kind of just makes consumers' eyes glaze over. But if you're actually on the shelf, it at least provides a physical touch point for you to really see and experience the product in a way that just being on a listing with a bunch of other products is not able to really capture. And I think that's actually one of the biggest reasons why that shift is coming backwards is just because if I actually see a product, I can at least toy around with it a little bit. I can kind of better see that sense of usability that makes me more likely to purchase.
I mean, e-commerce is growing as a percent of total retail sales, and it was accelerated
Absolutely.
by the pandemic for sure, almost like 8 to 10 times just within that in 2020. They've been going up like maybe half or 3/4% each year in terms of total retail sales, and it jumped up like 4 or 5%. So there's a big increase. It didn't quite max out where people thought it would, but it still continued to grow. But the reality is, I think end of this year, 16% of purchases in retail will be in e-commerce. Majority of purchases are still happening in stores, and I think, as much as I think brands that are going to win online or on Amazon or on their D2C store is giving someone as tactile an experience as possible online, and especially like I think clothing companies or things like Stitch Fix, why they end up being successful is they allow someone to try and then I don't like this, I want to send this back, and I don't want to hold on to it, and maybe things that work and that people buy, you can say, okay, well, we're starting to see this product purchase, let's start to sell this or get this out into bigger distribution. But
Yep.
something like clothing, people need to try on and feel how it fits. If I wear
Yep.
something and it grabs my stomach or my chest or something the wrong way and I don't like how that feels, it's uncomfortable, I don't feel like I look good, I'm not going to keep wearing it. In the same way that like something might be good for me and have 20 grams of protein or whatever, or be plant-based, whatever the case may be, but if it tastes bad, I'm not going to keep purchasing it. So people need to know what it's going to be like in their actual lifestyle. And that's
Yep.
something that on Amazon, a lot of people will just put up a couple of product photos and call it a day. And you have to go way further than that because people are making, especially because people's eyes glaze over, they're making really quick purchase decisions and they got a lot to look through. So if you don't grab their attention and you don't give them a reason why to purchase your product and get past any objections that they might have right away, they're already on to the next one.
Yeah, and to add on top of that, from an economic standpoint, the big reason why you're seeing brands shift into retail is just because once you hit a certain level of scale, the customer acquisition costs really start to balloon. You saw in 2016 and 2017 this huge proliferation of direct to consumer at the time
Yeah.
because the space wasn't as crowded. You had lower advertising costs. You could really get out to the market on Google and Facebook and acquire customers at a point where I still remember seeing pitch decks where the whole idea was actually we're going to be cheaper than a retailer because we can cut out the middleman and go directly to them, so that way everything's
Yeah.
cheaper. And that was what really climbed this huge boom at the time. But as you start to see more brands come onto the ecosystem, and now a lot of advertising channels are really constrained to being within those, like the big four or so.
Sure.
You now as you're trying to go from a million to 10 million to 50 million, every incremental cost you're competing for more share, but then every cost per click is just much higher. And so at a certain point, you really start to see that
You're also
contribution
having to
margin per
build bigger
unit.
brand awareness. You
Yeah.
can't just go for the
Yep.
immediate purchase. You now have to build awareness beforehand so that people can go into a marketplace or go to your website or go in store and say, hey, now I know about this brand. I'm kind of thinking about this brand. I'm looking for them, as opposed to just like some brands on Amazon. If you're looking for like the right charging cable, you're just looking for the thing that maybe meets a couple of your requirements, length, the right connectors, and cost. And is it reviewable? Is it going to last for a little while? You may not be following the brand of charging cable that you use, like for your iPhone or your Galaxy, whatever. You may not be following that company on Instagram or going and purchasing directly to their website because it's more of a convenience factor. But especially as you want to grow that brand awareness, you have to get out in front of that and start getting in people's mind before they start to go and make that decision, so that you're part of consideration, as opposed to just I'm going and looking for this specific product and I just need the best price or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, and that's the biggest challenge when it comes to attribution, is that it really is a bunch of soft impacts on the consumer that build up gradually that eventually make a consumer look at a brand and say, wait, I've actually seen this, not like explicitly noticed it, but I've seen it in the background a few times. I was familiar with the name. And then eventually that kind of builds up a level of trust almost, or at least a sense of familiarity for you to eventually make that official purchase. And sometimes it takes seeing a physical product to be like, okay, this is a real thing now, and I've seen it online, and now I can actually see and touch it, and now I think I'm ready to actually make that purchase.
One of the things for food and beverage brands too that I think about, it's really hard to be profitable if you sell like a flavor of chips, and people just want to try. They don't want to buy a 12-pack. They want to try a pack. You can't really make that super profitable if your price point's low online because of the cost of fulfillment and cost of, if you're on a marketplace like Amazon, the cost of that referral fee, the cost to advertise. A lot of people mistakenly say, "Oh, we want to take all of our sales from Amazon and bring those onto our website." That's not possible. That consumer that really is shopping and is utilizing Amazon, they're on Amazon for a reason, because they trust Amazon. Just like the person that goes to Target because they want to get their clothes and the toys and the pharmacy maybe aspect of it, and the food that they know is going to be there. And if they don't have the exact thing, they know that there are other options there. They go there because they trust that, and you're not going to pull that person away. But also, people say it's because we have better costs. But when you think about the cost to build a really great website that has good UI that's going to convert with people, that could be $100,000. That's not cheap. You still have to update and maintain that. That's something that a marketplace like Amazon is already taking care of. So, but the cost to get something profitable that's a smaller, especially food stuff that you want to sample or taste, you have more access, I think, to that person. I don't have data to support this, but I think if someone's able to buy a flavor or one product of yours and taste and say, oh, I like that, now they haven't gone in and wasted a bunch of money, but they know, okay, smaller upfront costs, so you've got more access to people because the dollar amount's lower, but now they know they want to go back and purchase, and you've got an advocate on your side.
Yeah, and that's why I'm starting to see a lot of brands that I've worked with look at direct to consumer as more of the brand building arm, whereas retail and Amazon, because of the high purchase intent,
Yep.
become those channels that are, the D2C is driving them towards. And when it comes to food and beverage, also the reality is that purchase behaviors are very much in the moment. I want to, it's, when you're going to a grocery store, we're buying there because I'm hungry, or I'm in the grocery store, I'm ready to go buy. Whereas when it comes to surfing online, if I'm not feeling like I want to make a purchase, I usually don't make that spontaneous purchase decision.
Yeah.
Which is also why Amazon's such a powerful channel, because you know that your entire audience is on there for their specific reason to go shop.
70. So I think like some of the data is really interesting, and it's pretty readily available. But like a good conversion rate on an e-commerce site, someone's like personal direct to consumer site, I think gold standard is probably like 3%. If you're getting above that, that could be like incredible. But like 3 is great, and most people are probably hovering between 1 and 2%. Non-Prime members that shop on Amazon, 14%. So those people who aren't even invested in Prime, which is the most powerful, like that's why people get and shop on Amazon, is because, yeah, Amazon's a marketplace, but they're mostly a trusted distribution network, and Prime is that. It's now a brand in and of itself. Amazon's licensing Prime with their new Buy with Prime service, where they're allowing direct-to-consumer brands to leverage Prime inventory and have that badge on their site if they meet, all the criteria, to then fulfill it to someone in Prime. So that's the trusted brand. But Prime members convert 70% of the time when they're on site. That's crazy. Yes. I know, like that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen on someone's direct-to-consumer site because there's not that inherent trust. But part of the reason why I think people convert so heavily on Amazon, one, they're there to purchase, and they know they have for a multitude of products at their disposal. But they know, if I don't like this, Amazon's going to let me return it. There's such a lower barrier to acquiring that consumer, because they know they're not going to be out the money, and that's why people's return rates are higher on the site too.
Yeah, but I mean, to also that point, you can see that the brand trust, a big portion of that is actually towards Amazon.
Oh, right, absolutely.
Itself, right? Which is why I think direct-to-consumer still plays such a critical role when it comes to making a brand investable, or even having long-term prospects, is that you have the ability to capture someone through a newsletter, through other, through promotions.
We've got really direct access to someone in that relationship. And so it's one of the things that, like, as much as I focus on Amazon, we believe in being omnichannel. That's what this podcast is about, the future of retail, which I believe is being omnichannel, and it's being in multiple places, being in the right places too. You don't have to necessarily be in every single store, but where's your target consumer going, being in those places. We know people are going to Amazon. We know people are shopping online. We know people are going to stores. So what's that right mix for you? But in order to get beyond, we know that Amazon's a necessary channel to be on, but in order to get beyond that, you have to create a really good experience for people. You have to showcase your brand at every turn with still making it be product focused and giving people reasons to purchase the product and getting past objections. But when someone receives your product, are they just getting it in a poly bag, or are they actually receiving something with nice packaging? Is it speaking to them? Like, are you doing those extra things that make people say, oh, I want to follow this person on social media. I want to go to their website, and I see on their website I can sign up for the newsletter, and there's exclusives, and I get a certain percentage off. Like, all those things matter. And so if you're just focusing on selling a product, I think you're missing out.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many touch points that come from receiving the product itself, right? So that's why when you look at a lot of the Amazon videos, they always emphasize the importance of having like a brand card or something that helps them engage and be able to just interact with them on a layer beyond just having a really good box and receiving a product and having a good experience.
If it's just Amazon's super product focused, and you're right that there's a lot of most of the trust is in Amazon, which is why you're able to get a little bit easier acquisition at times, because people trust Amazon. But you have to do more than just people buy the product, because then it's a means to an end. Your product's going to go by the wayside, and you're not going to be popular anymore, and the next popular thing will come along.
Yeah, and one of the things that I always love looking at is really cohorts analysis. Looking at the acquired customers and how they behave over a set period of time. And and I think one of the biggest challenges from Amazon is you do get to see some levels of repurchase behavior, but I think there is some limitations on knowing, like, okay, hey, this initiative ended up with these customers coming back. It's a harder, I would say, it's the challenge is really being able to do those investigations to figure out what is driving repurchasing decisions, and who are your actual loyal customers. And there's, I think, some levels of limitation as to how can I re-engage those customers beyond just having that listing readily available for them to purchase.
Yeah, I mean, just like any consideration why someone purchases something online, there's still a lot of considerations, even if it's not, in store and they're not touching or holding it. And Amazon has a lot of metrics to make decisions, more than I think people realize. But I was just talking about this with someone on my team. You don't get like heat map metrics on what images people are hovering over and what they're spending time on and what they're clicking on. You don't get that kind of like raw data to tell you, okay, this image is working, people are ignoring this one. And so, yeah, there is kind of an assumption that has to be made, and you have some limitations, which is why being in those different channels, like you said, allows you to build brand. If you're direct on your site, it allows you to find out more about what's working from a brand perspective, and then maybe you can extend that out to Amazon, extend that out to a Target or whoever else, whatever like other retailers you're in.
Yeah, and what you're really seeing, I think, at the end of the day, when it comes to the future of retail, is that every channel really does play a role, and they do have some levels of specialty, and you can be involved in all of them, but you have to also understand what are they good for, what purpose does it serve for the brand, and how are you going to allocate those resources accordingly, because it is also a lot of channels to kind of maintain.
Awesome, Kenny. If people want to find you, where would they go? Would they just like random street in LA breakdancing, or is there maybe like a more official place that they could go and find you if they wanted to find out more about you and what you're doing?
Yeah, one day you might actually just see me practicing out here.
I think that would be great. You're out in LA,
that
right?
Might be an actual possibility. I am. I'm actually right next to downtown, so I
okay.
like to go to. There's a local mall here with like a bunch of grass, and there's a gym, and I sometimes just end up practicing there. So you actually might spot me.
Okay.
But yeah,
be on the lookout if you're in LA, people.
Yeah, and if in terms of reaching me, feel free to contact me on my email. It's kenny.gen@pilot.com. So KENNY.JEN@pilot.com. And feel free to shoot me an email if you want to chat about something. I'm more than happy to.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining me, and to everyone out there who's listening, I never cease to be amazed at how deep this conversation goes. And there is Kenny mentioned at the beginning of the show, but talking about art and science, there's some data that you're going to need, and that's going to be required in order to get you to make informed decisions. But there's also an art to it, and understanding why people choose to do something. And sometimes that can be measured by data, but sometimes people are maybe making an impulse purchase because they're hangry at the store. If they want something, and they're like, oh, I've been wanting this frozen pizza, and I'm just going to get it now because I'm really hungry and I want to go home and make it. So I think that the level of detail that's there it never ceases to surprise me, and I'm just amazed at how like deep you can get in that. So I just encourage everyone out there, every brand out there who's listening, think about that end consumer, maybe why they would be purchasing, and be critical about what you have, so that for the betterment of your brand and your business, and saying, hey, are we really nailing this? Because if we're not, we want to make sure that we're nailing it and getting it right. But retail continues to change people, so stay on your toes. Until next time, thanks guys. Get out of here.
Take care. Bye.
All right, that was the show. What did you think? That was the longer game. We would love for you to share the show with other people and to leave us a review of the show. So go to iTunes, go to Spotify, you can go to YouTube, comment, leave a review, and share this on any social channels that you are active on and wherever you have influence. We want to share this story and stories like it to as many people as possible. Do you have a compelling story and do you want to come on the podcast and talk about it, and you're in the retail industry? Then go to thelongergame.com, fill out a form, and we will contact you about coming on the show. You can find us on any social channels, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and you can go to our website, thelongergame.com, to actually read all of these episodes in blog form in text, because we know not everyone's going to listen. This podcast is brought to you by my agency, Cartology. We are a customized, done-for-you service agency that helps brands win on Amazon. It is super complex selling on the Amazon Marketplace. We help simplify that for you. This podcast is also brought to you by Podcastify Me. They are a full-service podcast production company that designs podcasts around people who are paid for their advice. That is coaches. If you want someone to help create, strategize, and distribute your podcast to the masses, go to podcastify.me to find out more. I've so enjoyed that you've been a part of the conversation and that you've given of your time to hear these people's stories. We'd love for you to share. If you want to find out more, just go to thelaundrygame.com. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Stay blessed. And until next time, cheers.